Jesus, let us come to know you. Let us see you face to face. Touch us, hold us, use us, mold us. Only let us live in you. Jesus, draw us ever nearer. Hold us in your loving arms. Wrap us in your gentle presence. When the end comes, bring us home.
Continuing Jesus' second tour of Galilee. There'll be another one that we'll talk about maybe today, but if we don't get there. But Jesus cycles through Galilee 2 or 3 times as he's preaching and teaching in their synagogues and healing people and all of that. Last week, we talked about Jesus healing at the Sea of Galilee. He called the 12, and then we talked about the Sermon on the Mount. We didn't look at the Sermon on the Mount verse by verse because we could spend several weeks on that and not fully get everything out of that we wanted to, but the nature of our study is such that we talked about it, outlined the differences mainly between Matthew and Luke's narrative because Matthew's is significantly longer than Luke's. We talked about the probable reason for that has to do with the audience, that Luke was writing to predominantly Gentiles, Greek people perhaps, whereas Matthew was writing with a more Jewish perspective. And we said what sets it apart is in that Matthew, he says, you have heard that it was said, and he'll give a statement. But Jesus then would say, I say unto you. And so there was a reminder of what they were being taught in their religious world by the religious leaders. And Jesus was, in essence, making those things a little bit more difficult because he took it back not from just the action itself, but back to the heart. And so Matthew's was significantly longer than that. And so we talked about all that last week. And today we get to Jesus healing the Centurion's son in Matthew 8 and Luke chapter 7. And Matthew gives us the location again, Capernaum, there on the north end of the Sea of Galilee. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, dreadfully tormented. And Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another one, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. And when Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to those who followed, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And I say to you, that many will come from the east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then Jesus said to the centurion, go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done for you. And the servant was healed that same hour. And then in Luke chapter 7, when he had concluded all this saying in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Matthew and Luke agree with that. Certain centurion's servant who was dear to him was sick and ready to die. And so when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly, saying that the one for whom he should do this was deserving. For he loves our nation, has built us a synagogue. And then Jesus went with them, and when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Therefore I did not even think myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and another, come, and he comes. Do this and do that, and pretty much the same thing that was said in Matthew's account. You notice there's some slight differences between those two narratives. Back in Matthew, it says, a centurion came to him, pleading with him. And the rest of that narrative is couched in the centurion sending that message, whereas in Luke, there are others who come. The centurion sent to the elders of the Jews, pleading with them to come, sending them to come to Jesus so that he would come and heal his servant. And then, as Jesus was on his way, there were some others that were sent out to say basically the same thing that happened there. And as far as why those narratives are different, here's my theological answer. I don't know. The narrative, the storyline is the same. What's different is the details of the centurion came to Jesus versus he sent the leaders of the Jews and the friends. And so that's slightly different. Go ahead, Dave.
Matthew was Luke was detailed in the account he got from someone else.
Okay.
So he got Matthew or one of the other disciples. You know, so there could be differences in the telling of that, of the account there.
Sure. Differences in Luke's researched narrative of it versus Matthew's eyewitness. Mike?
I understand that, but we need to be careful there because that could take away the idea of inspiration.
Yes.
I am convinced both of these accounts are inspired by the Holy Spirit. And so we need to realize, okay, it's still the same author. It's God giving His word to the Holy Spirit. And so one writer does show some detail that the other one doesn't. But when an official representative goes out on my behalf, it's the same authority as if I did it. And we see that same thing throughout the Old Testament and all. One person being represented by another, saying that that person did it. But let's never lose sight of the fact that this is inspired of God. Why one reported it one way and the other way? God has a reason.
Okay, Mike points out that we shouldn't use this to say, okay, well, Bible disagrees with itself, therefore we put it up on the shelf and not worry about it. There's obviously a reason why the different narratives were there, and Mike makes the point that if the centurion sent someone, he was sending the same as himself, in that he sent this message to Jesus about, and I don't think that, I don't want to say it's not important, but that's not the crux of this particular story of what we're going to learn a message from. What I see out of this story is that in Matthew's account, he comes and he makes this point, and Jesus first of all says, I will come. Did Jesus have to come? No. We've already seen several times where he heals from afar. There was a sick person in Capernaum. He was over in another town and healed him from there. So Jesus didn't need to come, which makes me think Jesus already knew what the message was coming from this guy, and that's why he said, let me come, invoking the response of, you don't need to. We know you can make him well. And ironically enough, for me, if the leaders of the Jews are there speaking on behalf of this gentleman, he's saying, I'll go. They had to say, because it's what they've been asking, well, you don't have to, because he knows you can do that. What kind of mind games might that have played with the leaders of the religious world who were already at odds with Jesus? So come and heal his servant, but don't come to my house because I'm not worthy to have you under my roof. Now remember, Centurion, what nationality was he? He was Roman, or he was not Jewish, let's say it that way. We don't know what his nationality was, but he would have been in the Roman army, so likely from Rome or the territories that were conquered by Rome. And so he wasn't a Jewish individual, and he said, I am not worthy to have you come under the roof of my house. Steve?
Do you think maybe that reason Matthew excludes, the part about sending elders of the Jews to him is due to, Matthew's gospel is centered around the Jews, and so they may have taken it as chastisement of some sort, or a different way that Luke describes it.
Yeah, Steve suggests that maybe it has something to do with the fact that Matthew's writing to Jewish people, and that's perhaps why he didn't include them. Again, don't know. Like I said when we started this, I don't know what the complete answer for that is. But again, back to Mike's comment, we're not going to doubt the inspiration of the Spirit here because the narrative is still the same in what happened there. Penny.
Who are the elders of the Jews?
That would be scribes, Pharisees, whatever the religious leaders were of the day. And this guy, evidently, just reading something about him here, he loves our nation, verse 5, has built us a synagogue. So this gentleman, this centurion, was obviously very friendly to the Jewish people. He wasn't like probably most centurions who kind of hated the people they were in charge of and didn't want to have anything to do with them, but this guy was different. And so he had a good relationship with them, so much so that he could convince these people to go out and ask Jesus this question.
So elders are the Pharisees?
They're referred to as elders, they're referred to as rabbis, they're referred to as teachers. They kind of carried several titles in the biblical narrative, but
They went to Jesus
what it says, yeah.
on this gentleman's behalf.
On this,
This gentleman was
yeah,
very kind.
very kind to them, and again, the suspicious side of me would say he was very kind to them. They didn't want to lose the benefactor they had, so they went and I'm talking conditions of the heart that we can't know, but that's kind of my suspicious nature of why they would go, because they wanted to keep that synagogue up that he built for them. Perhaps. Bill.
Matthew was a tax collector, so he obviously had some dealings with the Romans before he was called to be first a disciple and then an apostle. It's possible this might be a precursor to telling the Jewish audience it's okay for the Gentiles to come to Christ.
Yes, there's a Gentile component to this, as we've had several times. Jesus is introducing the fact that the gospel is going to be for all, not just Jewish people. And here's another instance where Jesus heals on behalf of somebody who's outside of the Jewish faith. Fred?
Not only a Gentile, this is a leader of Roman theology, their culture, their everyday world in a big way. And for him to do this as a Centurion legion leader, wow, that's a pretty big step. And it shows other people that if this guy is doing this, it might open up the doors for many more.
Yeah, this was a big deal. This was not just a minor event that happened out in the woods somewhere. This was a significant event that took place for those people who were hearing that and seeing. It gave them a lot to think about, and probably challenged a lot, especially the Jewish people, challenged them about how they thought about those who were outside of the faith. And they hated the Romans anyway, because they were their overlords, they were their conquerors. There was not any love lost between the groups. And for Jesus, number one, to heal this guy, and for the Jewish leaders or the elders who came, who had to say, here's what he said, was kind of, I think, an interesting thing. Dave?
You might think that from verse 10, where it says that Jesus heard what this centurion said, he marveled. You might think, well, Jesus didn't see this coming. I think another translation is that he admired. And, the Greek has several meanings. I think Jesus knew this was coming. This was a setup. This was something that Jesus would use to teach us. So I don't think he was surprised by it. I think he had an admiration for it.
Dave suggests that idea of he marveled at what this wasn't because he was surprised by it. Wow, I didn't see that coming. Yeah, he did. He saw that coming, which again is why I said I think that's why he said, "Let me go with you," because he knew how that was going to play out. And of course, Jesus healed from a distance. That all happened. But notice and again, keep in mind that based on Luke's account, those who were delivering the message, Jesus said, "I have not seen such a great faith even where? In Israel." Was that a dig? It kind of sounds like it, doesn't it? Kind of a dig at the people who are bringing the message, saying to those people who consider themselves the pinnacle of spirituality that this centurion beat you out in that regard. What a statement for him to make. And I have not seen such a great faith. How did he see that great faith? Because of the centurion's actions, of what he did. Reaching out to Jesus, reaching out to a Jew. "You can heal him. You don't need to come to my house. I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof." What a statement of repentance. What a statement of confession of sins if we talk about that. I'm not worthy, but will you please? And Jesus does. So another hand. Dave, go ahead.
Now, the Centurion says his servant is paralyzed and tormented. While back, Linda and I visited Fort Smith, Arkansas, the old fort that was there, and went through a medical hospital type display. And it talked about a disease we no longer know called tetanus, lockjaw. And if you've ever suffered from leg cramps and other cramps, you know what the pain of that is. That was a way of dying. You weren't paralyzed. Your muscles were locked. And you were cramping all over your body, and it was a miserable way to die. And it was just one disease of the day that we don't experience anymore. We don't even know.
Dave suggested tetanus could be what this individual had. We don't know that, but symptoms could be consistent with that. Les?
Well, I think the statement that he's not worthy for Jesus to come to him, it may indicate, as the other passage said, because he had an admiration for the Jews, he shows a real understanding of how the Jews felt toward Gentiles, because for a Jew to enter a Gentile's house brought great discrimination for it. And maybe he didn't want to place Jesus in that situation.
Yeah, Les suggests that the fact that, again, Jew-Gentile, you don't eat at a Gentile's house, and so he didn't want Jesus to have to bend his morals, shall we say, to come to his house. Jesus wasn't concerned about that. Jesus would have gone, he'd have gone in, and he would have healed him and not had an issue with that, because that wasn't an issue to him. And you notice Luke's account, he just says he was sick and ready to die. He didn't say anything about the paralyzing, but this was that he was just sick. In fact, what did Matthew say? Paralyzed, dreadfully tormented, versus Luke's account, sick and ready to die. Again, Luke being the physician, maybe knew more about what was wrong with him. And this was a terminal thing. It wasn't just that he was paralyzed. It wasn't like the guy that was healed who had been lame for, 38 years? He was going to live for who knows how much longer. This was an imminent death that was coming, and Jesus responded to that. Penny?
On the other side of this gentleman, you have to think the good in him for coming for his servant. This wasn't his son. or anybody related, it was a servant. So even though he felt that he wasn't worthy, Jesus might have thought he was. Apparently he did.
Yeah, it was, again, there's I don't know how to describe it, but it's kind of a beautiful story of somebody from the very limit of being outside of the culture in which you lived, reaching into this person who is, in a sense, the epitome of the culture, and saying, can you help me? Will you help me? And Jesus said, yes, I will. Again, Jesus foreshadowing, as was said earlier, that Gentiles are going to be a part of this, and Jesus is going to love them and take care of them as much as he does for his own people. Steve?
Do you think at this time that the centurion was at great personal risk for, he's a representative of Rome, and he's coming to Jesus in this sense, and that would seem kind of really at odds of Rome's position, not only against Jews, but this so-called sect of the Jews.
Steve asked the question, was there a risk for the centurion to do this? And what do you think? Physically? Nah, not physically. He was centurion. He probably had soldiers. This wasn't a personal safety issue, but how might this have played out for him with his superiors?
Well, he'd already built a synagogue.
Yeah, he built the synagogue, so he had done that. So the threat perhaps was there be his standing with his own people versus, because, okay, building a synagogue, yeah. Keep those people quiet and happy, and they don't rebel, and we don't have to deal with them. That's a good thing. But Jesus, this centurion, then embracing that culture, could have been possible that he could have had issues with that. We just don't know. Fred?
I think leaders of men, when we work with them day in and day out, and if he's a centurion leader, and he has a servant that's been with him for years, through conflict after conflict, that is close as family gets. Brothers are brothers in that environment. And to go out and step out on a limb for another man, he's done it his whole career. And for him, that risk probably is fleeting by in fear. That doesn't exist in this. He was concerned about his servant, and that's what makes this story, you said the word, as beautiful as it is. Because it truly is. When people care for one another like that, isn't that what Christianity is all about? And he's doing this without being raised in that.
Yeah, Fred makes an excellent point that this is a story about compassion of a man who's got a servant. Not, again, we said not his son, not family, but his servant, perhaps the same as family in a relationship, and he was going to see that he was healed. And maybe his concern wasn't even how this is going to look. I'm going to get my servant healed if it's at all possible. Could be. Elwin, you had a comment a minute ago.
Yeah, since he loves our nation, that implies something right there. And I mean, seriously, if you love something and you're dedicated to it, because look at what Jesus said about his faith. Why was his faith so strong? Because he already loved the nation of Israel. He knew their people were under oppression, and he felt sorry for them. He had pity on them. He was had empathy for them. So I mean, if that's the way you're looking at the whole nation and you love him, he deserves it.
Elwin points out that he loved the nation. Text tells us that. And he was doing good things for them. So it tells us something about the man's character, that he was a good man, a perhaps, shall we say, kindly overlord as compared to maybe some of the other centurions who Jesus would have dealt with. But it's just a beautiful story of here he comes and he begs Jesus, heal my servant. And Jesus said, I will, and he does. And he marvels, Jesus marvels at the faith of the individual, because he points out, in essence, what he's saying to Jesus is, you are greater than I am, because I'm not worthy for you to come under my house. So he was acknowledging Jesus for what he was and who he was, and that makes, again, adds layers to this story that we're talking about today. All right? Other thoughts, comments? Dave?
I'm reminded of Cornelius, I think chapter 10. Pretty much the same thing, Centurion, and I would be part of me like to think this is the same guy, but I have no way of knowing. But, you know, a Centurion who had befriended the Jews, and I have to wonder, why would a Centurion, why would any Roman consider what we know about especially the elders of the Jews, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, why would any Roman want to be associated with them in the first place? It's kind of interesting to wonder about that they would, unless maybe they had been exposed to Jews from the dispersion throughout other parts of the empire. But still, it's kind of interesting to think that could this be the same guy?
Yeah. I think Dave's point was one that I thought about and have read authors who try to say we're at Capernaum now. Cornelius was where? He was at Caesarea. And so that some argue, well, it's a different place. Well, they would probably have been all over. That didn't necessarily. But some want to say, well, this was Cornelius that we'll read about in the book of Acts. Could it be? Well, I suppose within the realm of possibilities it could happen. Likely, probably not. But again, we don't know that, so we'll leave that for speculation. But it's interesting to think about in this particular narrative. Could it have been, and what would that mean if it was? And we'll just have to leave it at that because Scripture doesn't tell us that. All right. Did I see another hand back here, John? Did you raise your hand a minute ago? No? Okay. All right. Let's move on. We get back to our original map. Those are all the places where Jesus has visited, some many times. But notice there in the bottom, below the Sea of Galilee, close to the Jordan River, is the city of Nain. And that's the place that we'll visit next. Jesus raises a widow's son. Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. This is the only time this event is mentioned in the four Gospels, is in Luke's account. Now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him in a large crowd. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." And he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. And fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding region. Again, as we said before, and probably making way too much of this, but Jesus happens to show up when this funeral procession was coming out. There's part of me that thinks, well, I doubt it could have been, it could have been pure coincidence, but I can't help but think that it probably wasn't. That he got there about the right time. And here's a dead son whose mom is a widow. Now, just saying that much, tell me what you foresee about the future of that lady. Who's going to take care of her? That's, in that society, she was in a fragile position. There was no life insurance. There was no pension. There was nothing really for her other than if she had family, brothers of her husband or whatever who would take care of her, and none of that's mentioned, so we don't know. But all that aside, her son's dead. And that's an awful, terrible thing. And it says, when he saw her, he had compassion on her and said, "Don't weep." And he touched the coffin. That word there that's translated coffin is a word that probably more likely presents what we call a funeral bier, or a platform of some kind that they were carrying the body on, rather than like we see a casket that has a lid and all that stuff on it. But whatever the case may be, it's obvious this man was dead, and Jesus stops the procession. He raises him from the dead, and what an amazing story. Jim?
I'm gathering that he might have been dead for quite a while.
Yeah, it may be. I don't know that.
Getting ready to bury him.
Well, traditionally with the Jews, if you died, you were buried quickly because there was no way to preserve the body. And so they would hurriedly bury him, wrap him in all that stuff, and then a year later, they would come back, they would collect the bones of him, put that in what we would call, for lack of a better term, an ossuary. A bone box is what is the word said, and then that would be the permanent burial condition of that individual. So, yeah, we don't know how long he'd been dead. We don't know anything about the circumstances there, but this large crowd was coming out with her, so that suggests that he was perhaps well known, suggests that maybe the mother was well respected. Again, we're guessing here because we don't know, but they all came out. And what I think is interesting is that Jesus comes up and there's this large crowd, and we'll talk about in a minute what happened with that large crowd for this event. Steve, you had a comment?
Just a quick question. I know I'm splitting hairs a little bit, but it says a great prophet has risen up among us, and that also says God has visited his people. Are those statements really synonymous, or is there if somebody said God has visited his people, I would suggest, Jesus is God, right? But then a prophet, has there ever been a prophet to raise another person from the dead besides Jesus?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. Steve's asking the question there about God has been, the crowd that we just mentioned, when Jesus raises him from the dead, fear came upon all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen up among us, and God had visited his people. And I think Steve's question, correct me if I'm wrong, is, are those really synonymous statements, or what are they saying here? Because we don't have, well, we do have a record of prophet raising the dead, don't we? Elijah raised the widow's son, or was it Elisha raised the widow's son? So we've had that done before. So what does it mean? A great prophet has risen up among us, and God has visited his people. What was the crowd saying?
I think that was an assumption of the crowd.
Okay, an assumption of the crowd, Dave suggests. Amy?
It's just a quick question. Do you know why they dug up the body again in the home thing? Why not just leave the body?
Good question. I think part of that is, and trying to get stuff in the back of my mind to come forward that would prove this, but they were buried a lot of times in sepulchers, and number one, when you've got a sepulcher there, it fills up quickly. When they go gather the bones, they can put them in smaller containers and store more of them there. So I would guess that, just off the top of my head, that would be a suggestion as to why they did that. I don't know if there's no biblical command regarding that I'm aware of. So more of a cultural thing, perhaps. Elwood?
Did Joseph, what he do when he got to Egypt? They brought all their bones.
Yeah. They brought Joseph's bones back from Egypt to bury him. And Jacob, they took him from Egypt and went back and buried him, the bones there. So again, ancient burial practices, not really relevant to us and what we do today, but again, an interesting story. But let's go back to Steve's question. Their first response was, a great prophet has risen among us. Notice their first response wasn't, this is the Messiah. It's a great prophet. That was their response to that. And the fact that it says God has visited us, I would have a hard time thinking they made a connection between that and John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Something happened here that was astounding, that was off the charts. And their first thought to that is, maybe it's a prophet that's doing it. Maybe he's a prophet, because that makes sense to go there in your mind. That's a prophet, and God has visited his people, just as the prophets visited the people to mostly tell them what they were doing wrong. But is the idea there of, I think of what's being said here. that they classify him as a prophet, and God has visited his people. What's good about that is they give God the credit for it. They acknowledge that God did this, because man can't do that. So God did this somehow, some way. And the great fear came upon all of them, and they glorified God. And then verse 17, the report went throughout all Judea and all the surrounding regions. So just as we said in the previous healings or two, large crowds have been there. Great news went out everywhere. Jesus was becoming more and more well known by the things he was doing as he was healing and preaching and doing all those things. Dave?
I just wondering, maybe in your preparation you've come across, previously Jesus has healed blind people, he has healed and said, don't tell anyone about it. Now he's not concerned about it. Are there going to be any more occasions where Jesus heals someone and says, now don't tell anyone about it, or has that time passed?
I don't know. I can't remember chronologically if we come across that anymore, if this is the last time. We'll see, because we'll get there in our study. So I can't answer that question off the top of my head. Les, you had a comment.
Well, I think that this may have taken a little more than you even see on the surface. I'm not sure the next event is when I think John's disciples come to Jesus asking him. I'm not sure where that occurred, but according to Google Maps, from Chronological to Nain, 48 miles. Some versions say the next day, so Jesus would have had to travel 48 miles. Some say soon after. But I think it's indicating to us that Jesus knew what was about to happen in Nain, and he went there deliberately to raise his son.
Yeah, Les points out that he thinks this was deliberate on Jesus' part, again, for what's coming later, which we obviously won't get to this morning because the first bell's already sounded. And we've said this before, and this is just kind of our observation. Let's not make this hard fact. But it seems very likely that Jesus really didn't do anything by chance. But it seemed like he had a method to his madness, so to speak. That he was doing things for a very specific purpose. He had a 3-year timeline to get things done that he needed to get done. And he didn't just wander around Galilee for the sake of, I hope I run into somebody today. I think there was more to it than that. Couldn't prove that to save my life, but it seems to be that makes sense when you put everything together like we're talking about here, about what's going to happen next, that he happens to be in the right place where they came to him. And again, something to think about. Fred?
That's a fair assumption, I believe, because God, Jesus is Word. He's life. He is God. It might be a Trinity or a portion of however, that is, because I don't know that for a fact, but the Bible tells us they are one. So to me, everything Jesus did, from create Fred to knowing the day that I will depart this earth, that's all knowing, right?
Yeah, it's all knowing. Jesus had the ability to do that. We don't, but he did, because he knew what was coming. He knew, again, that as we said at the beginning of class, when the messengers from the Centurion came and said, can you heal this guy's son? And Jesus said, I'll come with you. Which is when they said, no, don't do that. Again, I think he already knew what was happening. That's just my opinion. I think he knew that, and that's why he said what he did, so he continued that conversation that would end up in saying there, wow, this is amazing. Yes. Yes, sir.
We know that Jesus is God, and to get a better understanding of what's going on in people's minds, this is actually not new language. This was going all the way back to Moses when he went over there to the people and inherited signs for the people. In Exodus chapter 4 and verse 30, they did signs. And then verse 31 is when people said that God is listening. And so Moses is a prophet, and Jesus is a prophet like Moses, Deuteronomy 18:20. And so Moses doing the signs with Aaron would show that God was there with them. And it says that God has saw their affliction. So they went through all these years of affliction. Well, think about the people in Jesus' time. They've gone through 400 years without any miracles, without anything from God. And all of a sudden Jesus comes, 400 years of waiting. Now God is somehow
Yeah, could everybody hear the comments back there? Okay, basically what was comparison made back to Moses. Moses and Aaron did signs. They were, in essence, God was there. God was with them. God was doing these signs through that. Comparison to what was happening now, Jesus, again, God has visited his people through Jesus. Israel had been in Egyptian bondage for years and years and years and years, and God, as was pointed out here, hadn't spoken to Israel in the past 400 years before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's accounts come into play. And so it's a parallel, kind of a connection there. And isn't it amazing how connected you get from Genesis to Revelation in God's Word, how it all fits together? That's, I think, a remarkable and wonderful thing. But we're out of time, so we're going to have to quit right there. We'll pick up, Lord willing, at the end of that next week and continue on from there. Thank you.